Order. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on topics under the jurisdiction of this committee, but not on today's agenda? Mr. Burke?
May I use the overhead? I have some sheets that I want to put on the wall.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Robert Burke, and I'm here to address the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force financial crisis. I've been told that the general fund budget right now is at $105 million, that the reserve fund is approximately $18 million, which is about 17%. And when I asked, the question was the reserve of the general fund used in the last 5 or more years, the answer was yes. Did I give you the second one, or do I still? Yeah. I want to get the top there. A little more. There are estimated 60,000 renters in the city of Santa Barbara. At $2.50 per year per rental unit paid by the renter, at $2.50 per year per owner unit paid by the owner, that comes to $5 per unit. $5 times 60,000 renters equals $300,000. So what I'm recommending is that $300,000 be used from the general fund reserve once for this year only. And this is to pay for the current program and to hire another permanent staff member to train under the current senior housing specialist. This also gives staff and council 1 year to set up a program to receive the renter and owner fees. Fees is an acceptable alternative to receiving money, and I have here from the harbor rate and fee schedule that fees are accepted, so I think we can pass that it's novel. I call this the fees for the harbor. They call them slip fees, parking fees, and things like this. Since we live in Paradise, I call this the Paradise fee. The rental owners, for example, collects the fees from the renters, say on May 1st. The owner pays per unit. The owner sends the check, say, on May 15th. The owner maintains a separate account in his or her bank that is specifically and only used for this fee. This relieves the task force from being in competition with the library, parks, and restorative policing. The task force qualifies for this one-time grant because it is new funding. The library, parks, and others would not, since they have old funding. Coming from both renter and owner, it keeps the funding neutral. Last page, please. So my rallying cry is save the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force, pass the Paradise Fee Plan. This relieves the council and everybody else from having, this is no longer a financial issue, this is a matter of values. There it is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for my time.
Certainly. That looks like that's it for public comment. I'll close public comment, and we're going to move the agenda around a little bit. Mr. Samario.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, we'd like to start with the second item, grants for rental assistance, and Simon Kiefer is here to speak to that.
Mr. Kiefer, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, members of the Finance Committee. I have a request here for grants for 3 proposed rental assistance programs. The 3 grants would total $585,000, and they would be funded with federal home funds. This is money that we get from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's distributed by formula, and it can only be used for affordable housing for low-income people. 2 of the grants would be targeted to homeless persons. One would be administered by the Housing Authority, and the other administered by Casa Esperanza. The third is targeted to persons in danger of becoming homeless, and that would be administered by Transition House. Each of the 3 organizations has considerable experience working with and working together with providing a range of services to the homeless. Each of the 3 programs is structured to address separate segments of the homeless population, and all 3 are established programs. They've been previously funded, they've been sufficiently road tested, and the home regulations would allow for setting up a rental assistance program which is tenant-based instead of project-based. And that means that the assistance rests with a tenant. They can move out and move that assistance then to another unit, whereas project-based stays in place and the tenants come and go. So I'll talk about each one of the programs separately. The Housing Authority would receive a grant of $300,000, and they would run a Section 8 type of housing assistance program. This is where participants receive a rental subsidy. They use this for rents in apartments that they have selected with assistance in finding them from the Housing Authority. And participants pay 30% of their income then for the rent. The balance of the rent is then covered by the home funds. Home funds would go directly to the landlord. And it's just like the Section 8 program, but we're setting it up because there's such demand for the Section 8 program. We've got 3,000 households on the waiting list right now, and the waiting time is at least 2 years. So that's something that's far too long to have somebody who's homeless wait 2 years on a waiting list for. So what we would do then is we would structure the TBRA program that we're proposing to work in conjunction with Section 8. So homeless people get on Section 8 to start with. They receive our TBRA assistance, and they receive that for the 2-year waiting period. And then at the end of 2 years, our TBRA ends, and either the homeless person or formerly homeless person then moves into Section 8 housing, or, best case scenario, they've been able to stabilize their life, they've got income now, and they don't need any further assistance. With the $300,000 grant, the Housing Authority would assist approximately 20 persons. That would be assuming then a 24-month period of assistance and an average subsidy of about $630 per month. The Housing Authority has previous experience doing this. We've given them a $200,000 home grant. Previously, this was back in fiscal year 2010, and this proposed home grant would enable them to continue this program and also expand it. So that's the Housing Authority part of it. Transition House would run a different kind of program. It's called Homeless Prevention, and it's a similar kind of assistance where we're providing rental assistance. Participants are paying 30% of their income for the rent, and we're paying for the balance. But what we're targeting here are people who are in jeopardy of becoming homeless. So they have some kind of financial issue that is temporary, that puts them in this kind of jeopardy. Long term, they do have the financial means to pay for their own rent, but they need assistance that's, typically speaking, 3 to 6 months is the length of the assistance that they need to get, and to avoid this whole process of becoming homeless, which can take years of cycling through and coming out of. Transition House has been running homeless prevention now for 3 years. They were funded with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act money, and this money is going away. So the proposed home grant would enable Transition House to continue this homeless prevention activity. With $150,000, they estimate they would be able to help 135 low-income at-risk families and also provide case management. The reason that they can provide so much more is that it's a shorter term that we're talking about. So it's sort of a critical infusion into these people's lives that enable them to stay housed. The third program would be run by Casa Esperanza, and we're proposing a $135,000 grant, and this is for rapid rehousing. So it's a similar kind of rental assistance, but it's targeted to a different group. We're talking about homeless people who have recently secured a steady stream of income. And this could be in the form of, let's say, a job or Social Security benefits, but they just don't have the money saved right now to move into housing. And Casa Esperanza estimates that can be like a 3 to 4 month period before they finally get it all together to then move into housing. So instead of having them wait that period on the street or in a shelter, this assistance would enable them to move in right away. So the assistance we propose here would be for 100% of the security deposit and 30% of that first month rent. Or the participant would be paying 30% of their income. We would be paying for the balance of that first month rent. It would just be a one-time infusion. After that, the participating household would be paying 100% of their rent. There would also be ongoing case management. So Casa Esperanza has been running this program like Transition House has for 3 years under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act money, which is going away. These home funds would allow them to continue this program. They estimate that with $135,000, they would be able to help 125 homeless persons, and there would be rental assistance along with ongoing case management. So there are strong benefits to all three. It's immediate assistance. We're getting people off the street or out of a shelter, or we're keeping them in homes and avoiding homelessness. It's assistance with a limited term. We're not establishing any long-term dependency. Casa Esperanza, rapid rehousing would just be this 1 month of assistance. Transition House is 3 to 6 months, and the Housing Authority would be capped at 24 months. The home funds would be used for providing rental subsidies only. The three providers will be raising funds elsewhere to cover the administrative costs for this and for providing case management. We have a deadline to commit our home funds. We need to commit $752,000 by the end of June, and so the funds requested here would help meet that deadline. So I ask that Finance Committee recommend to Council that we approve the 3 grants, and we have people from each of the 3 providers here to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from committee members?
No.
Mr. White? Mr. Kiefer, how does the level of this home grant funding from HUD compare with previous years?
Councilmember Francisco, we received about $725,000 in home funds in the current year that we're in. Next year's funds, which would come to us sometime, I believe, in the summer, we're going to be receiving about $425,000 in home funds. So we've been cut significantly.
Okay, and when? So the proposed programs are a new use of these home funds, correct? Because it was ARA money that was funding these previously. Is it? Did I get that right?
Yes, but we're spending out money that we've received previously from HUD, and so we have these funds that we have to commit within a 2-year window, and so this is an accumulation of funds that we've received in previous years.
Over how long a period?
Well, we've received home funds over a number of years,
right.
but these funds in particular are over a 2-year period.
Okay, so what I'm getting at is it sounds like the level of funding is going down, and this particular funding source hasn't been used for this purpose before, right? And I'm just trying to find out what it's been used for in the past.
We've used this in the past. We gave the Housing Authority $200,000 to run a tenant-based rental assistance program.
Okay.
So we have used this before for this purpose, and we've also used home funds to develop new housing units as well.
Okay. Mr. White, did you have a question?
I did, thank you. And that is, and your questions kind of stirred those thoughts. What's the basket of potential uses that this money could be used for?
Councilmember White, we have, like I say, what we've done in the past is we have used these funds to help nonprofits like Transition House, the Housing Authority, and other potential users to develop affordable housing, build new rental housing. And we have another project that may potentially be coming forward this summer that would be used for developing new rental units. So those are the only uses that I see on the foreground right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Would any of the representatives of these organizations like to say anything? Please. Yes, please.
Thank you for considering our request and the request of the Housing Authority and Casa Esperanza. I just wanted to let you know that our agencies have been using funding such as this through ARA to keep people in housing. We've tracked at Transition House with homelessness prevention our progress and also the cost of using funds to keep people in housing versus the costs of running them through their shelter, through our shelter system. And as you might imagine, it's cheaper to keep someone from becoming homeless than it is to have them in the shelter system and have them there for a duration of about 3 to 4 months, which Simon had mentioned is about the amount of time it takes somebody to get on their feet, start saving money to get back into housing. And for a shelter family, we're spending close to $7,000 for the length of stay for them, whereas the emergency cash rental assistance for several months plus corresponding case management, and we do the same kind of case management because we know their needs are the same as folks that are in the shelter system, costs more like $5,000. So it's cheaper to us, and there's the additional cost savings for the family or household that when they become homeless, they usually lose all their possessions, their furniture, they lose their dignity, their self-esteem, their self-confidence, and other, impacts that are not as measurable but are difficult for the family to dig out of. So we really believe in this as a methodology to prevent homelessness, to reduce the number of people that are homeless in the same way that Casa Esperanza's program of rapid rehousing minimizes their stay in shelter and the financial and psychological impacts of that. So we believe in it, and again, thank you for considering our request.
Thank you. Okay. Would you like to?
Thank you. Thank you for considering the Housing Authority and Transition House and Casa Esperanza for these funds. Skip Samansky with the Housing Authority. In anticipation of your question, home funds have been used by the Housing Authority to supplement new construction or to rehab existing units where there is a gap in providing housing and housing resources is essentially the startup to get an individual out of homelessness and get them established. Having a person sit and wait 5 years for Section 8 because the list is so long, there's really limited ways to accommodate that. This funding does that. It gives us the opportunity to take people that are listed through the vulnerability index and have them get housed much earlier. Trying to build a facility that would accommodate that would be very costly. These funds are very effective use in addressing that need. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Any further discussion? I would entertain such a motion.
Thank you. I'd like to express support for all three of these excellent programs and move that we recommend approval to the council of the funding requests.
And I would second both the intent and the motion.
Very good. All those in favor?
Aye.
So ordered. Mr. Samari,
Okay.
next item.
Thank
you
you.
all.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. We are going to continue our discussion of the budget, the fiscal year 2013 recommended budget. And we have actually 3 items that we're going to cover today. One is pretty straightforward, and we're going to start with that. And it relates to some recommended adjustments that staff is bringing to you to the budget that was filed back in April. And this is very typical when we file the budget in April. Between then and the time we adopt, we typically will find some adjustments that are necessary based on new information that we get in that period of time. So we're here to present those. They're very minor, as you'll see, but there's still things that we'd like the committee. Typically, the committee looks at those first, and we forward them on to the city council for their approval. So Michael Pease, our budget manager, will be talking about them.
Mr. Pease.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. What you see before you is a summary of proposed adjustments, really just a handful compared to prior years. So just to kind of walk you through this summary really quickly, we have at the top 3 columns, the estimated revenue impact, the impact to appropriations or expenditures, and then the net impact to reserves. You know, if revenues exceed appropriations, then there'll be an increase in reserves or a surplus. So walking through each adjustment, general fund is at the top, and there's only one change in the general fund. Well, there's a number of changes, but only one department is impacted, and that is the library department. The first change they have is to fund a library project development director, an hourly position to oversee the capital fundraising efforts for the children's library, and that is going to be 100% funded from the Peggy Maximus Trust, $50,000. The next few are kind of related. Basically, we've received updated or revised figures from the county for our county per capita revenue figures, and as it relates to the county small branches, we've also updated the figures for the administration, the cost that the city charges those small branches to administer them. That is $2,200 and $9,800. And basically that additional revenue is being appropriated in hourly salaries to supplement those services. Now, moving down to the county library fund, also, again, we received updated revenues from the county for the per capita revenue, again, impacting just those small branches in Goleta for Carpinteria, Montecito, and Solvang branches. And we've also received refined estimates for the Goleta parcel tax, which was approved by voters back in 1990 in County Service Area 3. And again, those additional revenues will offset existing use of reserves in those individual small branch programs. And the last item is relates back up to the general fund. Basically, again, the small branches pay a small administrative fee that is then deposited into the general fund. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions from committee members? Ms. Murillo. Mr. White?
Thank you. Peggy Maximus Trust?
Yes, we have, I'm not the expert on the Peggy Maximus Trust, but there are a number of trusts that we do donations, large donations that the library receives, and so we account for those separately, and you know they draw down on those funds, and Peggy Maximus is one of those trusts. Off the top of my head, I really don't know. I don't know if the finance director may know.
Yes, some of the trusts that we have could be in the hundreds of thousands, and there are varying degrees of restrictions. A lot of them are restricted, for example, to book acquisitions, but periodically as needed, the library will transfer some of those gift funds into either to the general fund primarily to help fund programs or one-time costs. But there are several that are in the hundreds of $1,000s range.
Can you email out just a little summary of what that
Absolutely.
what that is? I haven't heard of these before. Thank
Okay,
you.
Sure.
Mr. Peace, I'm not quite sure I understand the distinction between the two funds here.
Okay.
So you've got revenue from the county per capita
Basically,
fee in both of them.
yeah, the county per capita revenue is a funding source for both the general fund, library department, and also the small branches. The county provides it to the general fund and to each of the small branch programs.
Okay. And that appropriation of $2,253, is that backfilling something that was coming from the general fund, or is that something new?
The $2,200 is something new. It's just refining our estimates on what that administrative fee will be for each of the small branches, and so then that's being deposited into the general fund.
Okay, very
into
good.
the central library.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Michael.
With that, I'd like to have the committee
Forward
approve those and forward to the-
recommendation to council.
We
Sure.
can do that.
Thank you.
May I have a motion to that effect?
I so move, Mr. Chair.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Passed. With unanimity.
Okay, so the next two items we're going to kind of cover together in three separate PowerPoint presentations. it's a discussion of infrastructure financing, and this was a request from Committee Member White that we bring back some information on how are we doing, where are we at with keeping up with the maintenance of our infrastructure, our facilities, and as part of that, what are some options we have for financing larger pieces of facilities and like buildings and the like. So I'm going to start with a presentation that summarizes the recommendations of the Infrastructure Financing Task Force that was created a few years ago. I think all of you have a copy of that. I forwarded that to you electronically. And then we'll follow that with a presentation from Jim Dewey, who's our facilities manager. And he's going to talk about specifically where are we at in maintaining our facilities and what's sort of the backlog for maintenance as well as renewal. And then I'll close up with a discussion of reserves, which is the part 2 of that discussion where we had before, and to bring back to you what we believe to be a policy, at least a draft policy that's responsive to your feedback as well as council's feedback back in March. So with that, I'm going to start with, again, a recap of the Infrastructure Financing Task Force recommendations. And just a little bit of history. Back in 2007, council did approve that the formation of the task force. It was on the heels of reviewing the CIP plan, a 6-year plan that we do every 2 years. We update that. And in that report, it identified $146 million of unfunded capital needs, and I should say capital, not capita. And back then, when we were producing our CIP, we never really added things that we considered or staff considered to be kind of wish list items. We've since updated that, so now in our CIP, we do include things that we really need, not just those that we expect to be funded. So back in 2007, they identified 146 million, but it was a much larger number. And just to give you some context, today, if you look at our 6-year CIP, it identifies $316 million of unfunded needs. That's citywide. That's not just a portion funded from the general fund, but that includes unfunded needs in water, wastewater, and so forth. So later on in January of 2008, excuse me, council did establish a task force, and it was made up of appointed members from the community. And their mission was essentially to look at our current capital planning, identify the capital needs to ensure that they accurately reflect the needs of the community. They also looked at our overall financial condition and situation. Of course, this is pre-recession, so it was a much different picture that they were looking at back then. And they also were tasked with reviewing budgetary practices, reserve policies, and capital financing strategies, and then make recommendations on all of that. So if you remember the report, they had listed some financing recommendations, and these are just some highlights of the ones that I think are most cogent. The highlights include to commit to implement and achieve an annual 10% off the top general fund capital infrastructure. That means that we'll take 10% of our revenues and budget it basically an amount equivalent to that would be transferred presumably into a capital infrastructure financing fund of some sort. They also recommended that we fully fund the annual facility maintenance costs of $2.1 million annually and then conduct the work on a regular basis. And Mr. Dewey will be talking about that number specifically because we're not there right now. We're not funding $2.1 million per year. And then they also recommended assessing the potential for adding a half-cent sales tax for critical infrastructure projects. I know we've been talking about that in the last few years. And then to maintain the option of issuing new voter-approved GO bonds or general obligation bonds to pay for major infrastructure projects. On the management recommendations side, their recommendations indicate that they believe that the police station and fire and emergency facilities be the highest infrastructure priority. As you know, we've already done some major work to Fire Station 1, including building an emergency operations center and a training center there, but there's still some needs on the other stations for upgrades that haven't been addressed. They also recommended reducing costs and freeing up funds for capital by sunsetting underutilized and outdated programs, initiating zero-based budgeting every 4 years, and that means just wiping the slate clean, and instead of, as we do, sort of starting with a status quo budget from year to year, just saying, okay, we're going to start and see what are truly our needs and develop a budget that way to see, maybe we have some monies freed up that way. They recommended closing, leasing, or selling general fund facilities that are not needed, and then also disposing of surplus property. And then the last that I've highlighted was to implement periodic reporting to enable council to track and review the progress in implementing these recommendations. So on a kind of a current status, as I mentioned, there have been some projects that have been funded in the last few years, the Fire Station 1 remodel, the Carrillo Recreation Center. There are still lots of projects still in need of funding, being, for example, the police station and then the 911 call center. The Cabrillo Arts Pavilion needs additional work of about $7 million. The library, plaza remodel, library renovation. As you remember, most of these were going to be funded, at least in part, by the monies we have from the RDA, which are right now vulnerable. And of course, with the loss of the RDA, we will probably lose a significant portion of that, which puts more pressure on how we fund these projects. And just to recap what's in the report, some of the financing options are that we would carve out a portion of existing revenues, and it's kind of the same concept, we're going to take 10% off the top. It would mean reducing costs in the organization by an amount that would be meaningful, like $1 to $2, $3 million per year, so that we can free up and create a surplus that would be that we can accumulate in a capital infrastructure fund, or we can basically assign those additional revenues or surpluses for debt service and issue certificates of participation. COPs are interesting in that they really represent a lease obligation. They don't require voter approval. It was a mechanism that's been used for many years in the past by local agencies to finance infrastructure projects. We used that back in the 80s to finance the improvements to the golf course as well as the improvements to this building. The general fund is paying about $350,000 per year in debt service on that debt. But this is one option that's available. It's kind of lost favor lately, but it is one option that we have. There's also the option of putting a tax measure on the ballot, for example, an increase in sales tax. If it's a general tax, it only requires 50% plus one approval, and there's no restrictions on it. It can be used for anything, but obviously council at its discretion can use that for capital infrastructure financing. We could put a special tax on the ballot. Requires 2/3 of voter approval because it is a special tax, and it would be restricted for whatever the intended purpose is, presumably for capital infrastructure financing. And with either one of these options, we can include a bond measure along with it, and that those revenues then would be used to service the debt on that bond, like a GO bond, for example, that's backed by a property tax. So those are just some options. So that's really just kind of framing the discussion. I would like to turn it over to Mr. Dewey to talk about where we're at with capital maintenance.
Welcome, Mr. Dewey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. I'm going to be providing an overview of the capital maintenance program and for the general fund buildings. First of all, this is managed by the Facilities Division of Public Works, and it's funded through intra-city fund transfers, primarily through the general fund, but it also includes fund transfers from enterprise funds that reside in general fund buildings. It provides for the renewal of building systems, and I'll be going into a little bit more detail about what those systems are. But I want to make clear a couple of things, that capital maintenance has to do with the renewal and maintenance of systems within a building, and then major capital renewal has to do with the renewal of buildings after their useful life has been expended. Okay, so kind of two different things here, and so I'll be talking a little bit about each one of those and the liabilities associated with them. So capital maintenance, we replace building systems. All building systems have a certain life cycle associated with them. Those systems include roofing, doors, windows, electrical, mechanical, plumbing systems, interior and exterior finishes, all of the internal components that you would expect to maintain to keep a building running properly. This is a breakdown of the square footage of our general fund buildings. We have about 485,000 square feet, and they're divided amongst these different programs. Parks and Recreation represents a large portion of that, as well as the Public Works corporate yard, and the library has about 61,000 square feet in total. This chart provides a breakdown of our gross square footage by age, and you can see from the chart that we have most of our buildings were built prior to 1960, so most of them are over 50 years old. Many of them are over 75. A few of them are over 100 years old. And when we talk about major capital renewal, I mean, this represents a liability to the city. Eventually, those buildings are going to need to be renewed. Right now, there isn't really a funding mechanism that we have currently to do that. This is the building maintenance budget. So all the buildings right now are currently being maintained through the building maintenance program. So we dedicate about $1 million towards construction services. What that is, that's funds that come in from primarily enterprise funds where we do work for them on a chargeback basis. We dedicate about $660,000 towards service calls. So we need to be able to respond to all the people who reside in general fund buildings for responses for a broken air conditioning system, leaking water pipes, whatever, unplanned maintenance. So this really doesn't include any maintenance function. Then we have about $240,000 a year that we dedicate towards routine maintenance. And these are maintenance contracts to maintain elevator systems, air conditioning systems, overhead doors, things like that. And then we have $1.2 million that addresses the capital maintenance, in other words, the replacement of all those systems that I've been talking about. That is currently underfunded. That table on the right shows a breakdown of the actual funds coming from the general fund. So right now, for our whole program budget, we have about $3.1 million. About 1.8 of that comes from the general fund. And the general fund is funding about $850,000 of the capital maintenance currently. We have a backlog in capital maintenance, and according to our facilities resource renewal model, that's about $20 million just for the replacement of those systems. Now, the facilities resource renewal model is a web-based system, and it's a life cycle model of building costs for capital maintenance. In reality, when we replace a system, it usually triggers other events. We might have to deal with asbestos abatement. We might have to deal with code compliance, ADA issues, or fire issues. And so in reality, the $20 million only reflects just the basic cost of replacing those systems. The whole cost really is about, I estimate to be about $50 to $70 million. So that is our current backlog of capital maintenance in our buildings. And that does not include the police department, because right now we're assuming that that's going to see a major capital renewal, which will, take away all that backlog. And the backlog is growing because the program right now is underfunded. So this is a breakdown of the capital maintenance backlog by program. And as you can see, again, most of that is in the parks and recreation buildings. This chart shows.
Mr. White has a question. Thank you. On that chart, I see that you do have a police number in there. Can you explain how that dovetails into the bigger issue that the gorilla out there, as it were?
Committee Member White, yeah, this is from the facilities resource renewal model, so I didn't make any corrections for that. This is just, how the program spit the information out to me. But this is the basic cost of the renewal that I've identified in those buildings. In reality, we know that we need to build a $50 million building. Of course, that would take away that backlog. So this is just how it appears according to our model right now.
Of course, Ms. Murillo.
Thanks. Mr. Samario, these documents on the end of the table, are they related to these parts? Can I grab one? I like to look at something.
You want one? No, thanks.
This will help us, Mr. Dewey.
Thank you. I want to emphasize here that according to the facilities resource renewal model, that we're talking $20 million, and that's how this pie chart is broken out. But in reality, the total cost will be $50 to $70 million in order to complete all of this work. This chart shows our current funding level, which is $1.2 million for capital maintenance, and a projection of our backlog according to the FRRM. And you can see that the backlog is growing. This is the level of funding that's needed in order to keep the capital maintenance backlog from growing, to keep it at a steady state. So we would need to add about $900,000 annually to that program just to stay even with the current backlog. The next two slides are projections of, if we stepped up, brought in another $900,000 on top of that, funded the capital maintenance program at $3 million instead of $1.2 million, we would start to reduce our backlog. And even though this backlog is based on $20 million, it would still be reducing the $50 or the $70 million number that I talked about before. And this is just another example of funding at $4 million. So I want to contrast the capital maintenance program with a major capital renewal. So I've been talking about our capital maintenance program. It's the replacement of building systems, maintaining a building so that it will be usable during the building's useful life. Well, the capital renewal has to do with the renewal or replacement of a building after its life cycle has exceeded, or after its life has been expended. And so that includes major structural upgrades, major code upgrades, any major remodels that would make the building more functional. And it may even include the demolition of the existing building and its complete replacement, like what we're proposing for the police department. In terms of liability, our current capital maintenance backlog, we're estimating to be $50 to $70 million. In capital renewal, we have a building stock that I valued at about $360 million, and that includes 480,000 square feet with an average building life of 50 years. So based on those numbers, we currently have a capital renewal backlog of about $218 million. So in summary, things that we need to think about, we need to fund our capital maintenance program, provide about $900,000 more funding per year just to stay even. And ideally, we need a little bit more than that to take care of some of the deferred maintenance backlog, or the capital maintenance backlog. And then we also need to prepare for this $218 million capital renewal liability. And I'm sure that there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but bond funding and or annual contributions to an infrastructure capital funding plan. And basically, probably about half of our buildings are really up for major capital renewal now. And what happens over time is that when they don't see that renewal, our cost of maintenance go up, and also there's certain functionalities in that building that may not be available to the city as the building comes to a more dilapidated state. So I mean, that's what we see, is that our costs start to rise, our annual costs of maintaining the buildings rise, and then the functionality of the buildings decrease. And I would like to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Dewey. Any further questions from committee members? That's not a question. Thank you very much. Oh, did you have a question, Ms. Murillo?
So this, thank you. The infrastructure committee's recommendation to take 10% off the top, does that help what Mr. Dewey's talking about?
Sure.
And have you analyzed that? And It seems like
Yeah.
a lot.
It is, Mr. Chair and Committee Member Murillo, if we were to take 10% off the top, that's about $10 million, a little over $10 million per year from our general fund that we would have to carve out somehow. I think it's fair to say that would be a big challenge to do that, because that would mean decimating a lot of our parts of our organization. Even carving out $1 to $2 million would be a challenge. But so 10%, yeah, I think is really an ideal number, but probably unrealistic in our current situation, particularly in light of what happened in the last few years.
And, this year seems, there's a whole lot of tax proposals on the ballot. It's too late for us to do something like that. But I guess that's a possibility that, I would consider when, the smoke clears or something. And I do believe the public would be responsive to our needs. Thank you.
Mr. White.
Thank you. Sort of had to get over the hit there. How are the enterprise funds okay? How would you obviously the focus here is general fund, but is just because of their funding systems, you could consider them to be, how much better shape are they in than the general fund?
Committee Member White, I can't really address that. I do not maintain the enterprise facilities. I know that they do have significant deferred maintenance backlog.
Okay. Smart.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that when you look at the $316 million number that's in our CIP document as unfunded needs, a good portion of those would relate to enterprise funds.
Okay. I have to say I don't. I see for example, the water stuff coming through because of my liaison activities with the water fund, but I don't have a picture of that in my mind of going, okay, like the police building is an example where I know what the priorities are. What would be the top couple of priorities that come to your mind in the enterprise fund area that are?
Yeah, maybe
Okay.
Ms. Anderson could speak to that, our Public Works Director.
Ms. Anderson.
Thank you, Committee Member White. As you're familiar from being on the Water Commission, the enterprise funds in the water resources side, wastewater and water, have a little bit different type of infrastructure. They do have a lot of structures, but they're plants primarily. So you've got a major operational, functional activity rather than simply the building structure. So we look at that as all one element of the infrastructure requirements that we need to be maintaining. And I think you'll see as we go through the update of our 10-year plan for each of the water resources groups that we're trying to smooth out and understand how we can best manage what we see as both technologically requiring upgrades in order to meet our code, our regulatory requirements for how we handle water and wastewater systems. But we also have elements, just as Mr. Dewey mentioned, for the other regular general fund buildings, component parts, the pumps, the systems that are sort of the mechanical parts of those operations. We can do replacements by components. And those can be very expensive, but those are another mechanism that we use to try and forecast what those needs are. So I think we have an unmet, unfunded, at this point, liability for some of those larger capital investments that are 30 to 40 years old in the water resources area. We have a different funding mechanism with our rate structure, the ability to bond, and the potential for state revolving loan fund mechanisms that allow us to spread those costs a little differently. So not that everything's covered, but it's a little bit different picture, and I think you will be seeing that as we come forward in the next year with the 10-year plan. Airport, I think, is doing well. They should be in good shape for a bit. Yeah, in terms of the other infrastructure areas that are enterprise funded or non-general funded. I think you've also seen our report on the transportation system, which is another major component, not so much in the building side, but in the infrastructure elements of the roadway system.
So we will be seeing something in the next year. You were saying a 10-year plan is coming forward for.
I'm sorry, for the water systems, for both water and wastewater, we will be updating our 10-year plan projection for the fund, what our capital needs are, and what our revenues forecasts look like. And a couple of weeks ago, actually it's been a month or so ago, when we provided our pavement maintenance report, that's kind of your background information for the transportation maintenance system.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thank you very much. And then another question is the 900,000 that would allow the city not to be going further into maintenance arrears. Is that in? I don't know whether that's in our budget for this year or not. Is that is not in our budget for this year? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dewey.
So as I said, this is a continuation of our discussion. I think we had it back in April. We started the conversation of reserve policies, and we presented to you council's feedback, and then we heard your comments and feedback, and so we're now here to kind of talk about where we're at. I have a draft of our policies. We just sort of took a stab at writing something up. This is a draft. We're not going to go to it in the detail here. I've actually, I've sort of highlighted all the sections within our PowerPoint, so we'll go through that. I believe this is responsive to the feedback we got from both City Council and Finance Committee. I wanted just to review what that feedback was. So from Council back in March, we heard that the use of the policy reserves should require a plan for restoring reserves. And I also want to make sure that there's a distinction between the use of policy reserves, whether it be the budgetary reserve, the disaster reserve, or what used to be our capital reserve, versus reserves that we call above policy. So if our policy requires $25 million, but we have 28, there's $3 million of excess or extra reserves. We're not speaking about that portion because we think that those should have more flexibility. But when we're talking about use of policy reserves, that's what we're talking about here. They also recommended that the policy should require regular status reports to council, that the purpose and allowable uses of reserve for future year's budget should not change. However, it needs better definition. And they suggested eliminating the $1 million capital reserve. And also in the policy to consider reserves in other funds where we might have access to those. And in some cases we do, and in some cases we don't. And then they suggested considering recommendations of the Infrastructure Task Force, which is why we talked about that. The Finance Committee, all of you, the response we got from you was that we should specify more clearly when and how policy reserves are used and replenished. There was some suggestion that we required an objective measurement of the financial condition at the time we were considering using reserves, so we really know kind of where we're at and also what it's looking like in the future. That we should provide some guidelines relative to financial condition that define the triggers or thresholds of when they can be used, so the amount, but also over what period of time should they be used, and that they also should provide guidelines of how and when they are restored. So a little more clarity on that. Also, feedback was that we create a stronger voice within the policies in preserving the reserve balances, and that they be restricted to what they're referred to, Mr. White, true rainy days, so that the policies support that. So our recommendations, and you've seen some of these, so I want to just review with you that what we heard was that we want to preserve the 25%, or at least the 25 reserve requirements broken down between a 15 disaster and 10% budgetary reserve, that it still be based on a percentage rather than a fixed dollar amount. and that we are recommending, based on the feedback, that we eliminate the general fund capital reserve. And what that means is that we're not going to just lose the money. It's just going to be folded in and added to our other reserves. And also that we allocate future general fund surpluses as follows, that 50% of that, any surplus we have, go to a capital sinking fund for infrastructure, that the balance, the other 50%, goes to maintaining and or restoring reserves. And we talked about the idea or the concept that as our operating budgets grow, our reserve requirements will also grow because they're a percentage. But that 50% would use to maintain that level of 25%, and then also, to the extent we have extra, to build back any deficits we have in reserves. For example, today we know we are about $6 or $7 million below where we should be in our budgetary reserve. So if we had $1 million surplus in 1 year, this would provide that half of that, or $500,000, goes to the sinking fund, and the other half goes toward restoring those reserves that are currently in deficit.
Ms. Murillo has a question.
Thank you. Can you describe, for the benefit of the public and me, what sinking fund
Sure.
means? That sinking?
It's just a fund where we're accumulating dollars for use for a specific purpose. In this case, it would be used to fund capital infrastructure projects. As Mr. Dewey indicated, projects that extend the life of facilities and not so much just to maintain them. So it's the kind of projects that are bigger dollars. But again, it would be sort of putting some money aside to at least help in financing some of those big projects. So that's what a sinking fund is. It's separate from our general fund. We would transfer it over and just track it and account for it in a separate fund for that use. And then the last bullet indicates that the surplus would be calculated after funding of our annual capital program, because as you know, we have anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million at least of just ongoing capital needs of playground equipment and the like, that we would want to have those funded from revenues before we calculate what our surplus is, and then the surplus would be in part for capital for bigger projects. So that should say weight versus wit. But for enterprise funds, we believe, and I think Mr. Committee Member White had indicated that he'd like for us to consider any unique needs of enterprise funds, and I believe that there are. We met with the Water Commission a couple weeks ago, and they are going to include that on a future agenda item, a broader discussion of what are their needs, because I think they are different than the general funds reserves when you talk about disasters and the contingency reserves. So we're going to wait for that feedback. I know the Harbor Commission also wants to weigh in on that. And then I've asked department heads who have enterprise funds to provide some feedback. So we want to bring that back to you separately. So the focus here will be on the general fund. And then we believe that, pretty straightforward recommendation for the internal service funds, that we just establish a 10% operating reserve requirement. That's for our information systems fund, our building, our fleet maintenance, and building funds, that we establish a 10% operating reserve. They wouldn't be subject to the same 25% reserve for disasters and the like. It would just be a 10% operating reserve. Currently, there aren't any reserve requirements applicable to internal service funds, and we believe there should be.
Mr. Samario, just a question about that. It was my understanding that, you gave the example of the fleet replacement fund. It was my understanding that has been funded in order to cover known contingencies, and that it.
Sure.
So why does that need reserve?
I'm referring to the more the maintenance side. We are accumulating funds for the replacement of vehicles, but we have to also maintain them, and that's just more of an operation.
Okay.
And we believe a 10% operating reserve is appropriate.
Thank you.
So some just general fund recommendations, some general comments. We believe, and we heard, that there wasn't a lot of confusion regarding the use of disaster reserves. It was pretty clear, but still wanted some additional clarification. It was really in the use of what I'm calling now the contingency reserves, where there were a lot more clarity was needed. And just we want to make sure that we understand that the use of contingency reserves has always been available for disasters. In fact, if you look at if we had a major disaster, we would probably look to use the contingency reserves first before we use the disaster reserves. But that in those cases, we shouldn't put too many restrictions on on that use because it's pretty straightforward. So a disaster, pretty clear. We should be able to use pretty readily the contingency reserve and the disaster reserve. Again, most of the clarity we heard was needed in the contingency reserves. But we also wanted to avoid being too restrictive or formulaic. There was some discussion or comments about perhaps saying if we have a loss of tax revenues of 5% or 10%, we should consider that to be a trigger. We wanted to provide for judgment of both staff and council, and when we use that, but still, I think the reserves, as you'll see, are provide enough restrictions and limitations to the intended purposes I think that you described before. Oh, yeah, and then as I mentioned before, the use of reserves above policy are only, and you'll see they're only generally covered in this proposed policy, but again, most of this relates to the use of reserves that are established pursuant to city policy, the disaster reserve and the contingency reserve. If we have extra, it's not really covered by this policy other than very generally. So the policy kind of refers to, it has some general requirements that are outlined, and one, again, that it's calculated as the percentage of the operating budget. And then just some technical things that we will be accounting for all of these in each fund that's affected. So the enterprise funds will have its own reserves, and we'll account for them in that fund, and same with the general fund. And they will be treated as a designation of fund balance, which means we are tracking them every year so we can know exactly what the balances are at any given point in time. And we do calculate reserves at the end of each year because once we close out the books, we know what the final numbers are and what the final reserves are, and then we portion them out. So this just indicates that they'll be done at the end of each fiscal year and reported to City Council as soon as practical because it takes us several months to close the year, but usually in October, November for sure, we should be able to come to Council and even the Finance Committee and tell you what those new reserve balances are. And that would be something we'd want to include within the policy, that'd be a requirement. And in addition to that, that any time Council wanted to use any of the reserves, including the surplus reserves, that we would come to Council with the status of those reserves. So at mid-year, for example, if Council or staff is proposing to use any type of the reserves, whether it be the surplus reserves or the policy reserves, that we would give to you an updated status of where those reserves are so you kind of have the context. Okay, so we're getting into specifics now. So this is the disaster reserve. I just renamed it. You know, in the old policy, I think it was called the reserve for, I think it was for economic contingency, which is a little bit of a misnomer because it's really for disasters. And I think we should just call it the disaster reserve. It is 15% of the operating budget. And we believe it should be restricted to use in cases of a natural disaster. And so we're talking about floods, tsunamis, fires, earthquakes, all those things that we know to be, you know, big disasters. However, I would, you know, and also just we're talking primarily for state or federal declared disasters. That would be a trigger, if you will, if we have something that's declared a federal disaster or a state disaster. We think it's obviously makes sense for us to be using those reserves. But there may be cases where you have, for example, a fire to a single building, the city hall burns down. It's not a federal or state declared disaster, but I think it would be considered a disaster for purposes of using these reserves. And again, as I kind of mentioned before, that we believe it's appropriate to indicate that we'd only use these disaster reserves after we've used any and other available reserves we have, because we might have some pockets of one-time money, and in addition, we would want to use the contingency reserves first before we tap into the disaster reserve. And then in these cases that we would suggest and recommend in the policy that only a simple majority of council be required, approval of council, rather than being more restricted, because it's, again, there's more clarity in these situations.
Mr. Samario, could you talk a little bit more about this idea of using the contingency reserves first?
Sure. Yeah, you know, to me, I see that we are establishing a 25% reserve requirement, 15% for what we call the disaster reserve, 10% for the economic contingency reserve, which is kind of how we see it. But in the case of a disaster, all those monies, in my opinion, are available to use for a disaster, and we shouldn't be limiting ourselves to only using the disaster reserves for disaster. We have 25%, you know, or $25 million. It's all available, and I would suggest that the priority should be that we use the contingency reserve first, and then if necessary, we go into the disaster reserve. So it's just kind of an order of use or order of priority that let's use the disaster reserves last and the contingency reserves first, because again, it's all available for a disaster. So, we have a situation where a building burns down and we need, I don't know, $10 million, and we happen to have $10 million in the contingency reserve. I would suggest we use that first before we use the disaster reserve. That's kind of all it means.
The only reason I ask about that is it seems to me disasters and economic disasters are totally separate events.
They are.
And we could have an earthquake that requires so much money being spent for emergency purposes, and then a year and a half later we have a depression.
Right. Right.
So...
And I guess the only thing I would say is that, I won't say the good news is, but with a major disaster, it would be typically declared a federal or state disaster, which means we would be subject to reimbursement from FEMA and CalEMA. We would also be able to tap into our insurance reserves, our insurance carrier policies, and to be able to restore those funds that we would use. A portion of those we wouldn't be able to recover, but a large portion we would through reimbursement from the federal and state government as well as our insurance carriers. So my anticipation or expectation is that those reserves would be restored and available, hopefully, to be dealing with, in the near term if we happen to have another sort of economic disaster.
Okay. Well, if we replenish the contingency first, I'd be happy with that.
All right. Those are all good questions. So here is the new, I'm calling it the contingency reserve, because it's not necessarily for economic contingencies, but it's for any contingency, and as we'll see in a moment. But it is 10% of the operating budget. Its purpose is to allow for the orderly implementation of a plan to address the fiscal impacts of unexpected events, to minimize disruption to the city, whether it be the organization or the community, in terms of services we provide. In terms of the allowable uses, and I think this is really important, that we're talking about using this, and it's restricting the use of these funds for unexpected and unplanned events, and of course, which means that to be unbudgeted items that have a significant negative fiscal impact on the general fund in this case. And as you can see, I have included, a natural disaster obviously would be an unexpected event that would have a negative fiscal impact. But it could be, for example, and you'll see in the policy, we've identified some examples of what of those allowable uses are. And that you can look at page 2 of the policy itself. So we mentioned natural disasters, but as you know, and it's becoming more and more difficult, but the state seems to be able to find more and more creative ways to impact local governments by taking away revenues or creating some kind of increased cost. So that would be potentially an example of an event that was unplanned that would have a negative fiscal impact, and it could be material. The RDA was a good example. We're able to manage that and hopefully not have to use any reserves because of the fact that we're getting property tax revenues. But there could be examples in the future where we get a $1 million impact that we may have to use reserves for that purpose. And similarly, we had an unexpected loss of external funding, whether it be a grant or entitlement. That if it was a material amount, we could consider that for using reserves to cover that on a short-term basis. I referred to before an unplanned loss or damage to a city facility. If we had, for example, a fire, we may want to tap into the reserves. I think it meets the definition of an unplanned event that has a negative impact. If we have an emergency situation where there's public health at risk, we may want to spend some monies on a one-time basis to mitigate that issue. And then also, if we have an adverse judicial action, if we get a large claim that exceeds our that's within our SIR, our deductible amount, but it's significant enough for us to have to pay out big dollars, that may be a situation, if there aren't adequate reserves in our self-insurance fund, where we might have to kick in some money potentially from our reserves. So those are some examples, but again, I think the key here is that they would be unplanned and unexpected events that are material in nature and have a significant negative fiscal impact to, in this case, our general fund. The unallowable uses is just the converse of that. It's if we have planned or anticipated events that have financial impacts, that's not what it's intended for. And I gave some examples. If for example, in 1 year we're negotiating increases to salary and benefits for our labor groups, we know that's going to have an impact, and we measure that. We provide counsel usually always with sort of the impacts on that through a multi-year forecast. That would not be a situation we would say let's use reserves for that, because that's not an unplanned event. We've managed that, and so it presumes that we're going to be able to find a way to cover those additional costs or additional revenues, or we can build that into a balanced budget in the future. Or similarly, increases to retirement costs that we know, because we get estimates of those. We should be able to plan for those things, and same as with health insurance premiums, we always make assumptions and build that into our budgets, and we make sure we balance with those estimates. So these would be examples of when we would not consider it to be, consistent with the intent of the policy. Some additional requirements. So those were we talked about the basic requirements. For some additional requirements is that that the use of contingency reserves would also require approval by council, but in this case, it would require a supermajority, which means at least 5 votes of council to use contingency reserves. The exception to that would be, as I mentioned before, that in the case of a natural disaster where we're having to use contingency reserves as well as disaster reserves, we would say that it would only require a simple majority. And then that we'd also have, and I'm going to talk about the last 3 in more detail, but that we would have an objective assessment of the fiscal condition of the general fund, that we would come up with a balancing strategy, and then a plan for replenishment. Those would be the 3 broad requirements within this policy. So starting with that first one, the objective measurement or assessment of the fiscal condition, then the idea is to really get an understanding, an objective, although there's always going to be subjectivity, but as best as possible, an objective understanding of what the scope of the problem is and the duration of the problem that was created by the fiscal impact that was unexpected. And we should be using, as we do now, if you think about a multi-year forecast, we kind of factor as much as we can, available data, but it would consider things such as our annual financial report. What's the financial condition at the close of the last fiscal year? What are our revenue and expenditure trends? What are any economic indices and trends that we can use, like population growth, CPI, and so forth? We could use local forecasts, like the UCSB Economic Forecast Project, or even forecasts we get from our consultants. For example, on sales taxes, we do get forecasts from Muni Services that help us kind of project in the future what sales taxes might be. So again, the goal here is to objectively, to the extent possible, define the problem, including the impacts of the event that occurred. And as one suggestion, we could use a version or the multi-year forecast as the vehicle to present that. So once we've kind of done the analysis, we can present to you a multi-year forecast that says, here's what's happened, which we kind of do now. We've done that with the impacts of the recession. Here's what it's looking like today, but here's what the forecast is for the future. And we try to define for council what the scope of the problem, what's our structural imbalance. And then the second component would be developing a balancing strategy, so that we should always include a balancing strategy when we're proposing to use a contingency reserve, and it should be comprehensive and that it addresses the scope of the impacts as that we defined in the previous step. And we should also be considering other measures to minimize the use of the contingency reserves, because that's one of the goals, is to preserve those reserves as much as possible. So we'd be looking at expenditure reductions achieved either through efficiencies or just cuts to the programs and staffing. We would look for any opportunities to enhance our revenues or increase our revenues, or even to identify new revenue sources. We should be considering other available one-time funds, whether it be like appropriated reserves or funds that we've had in the past just from various sources that are available to the general fund. And so all those things should be considered in the long-term sort of balancing strategy, not just looking at the contingency reserve itself, but looking at these other measures as part of an overall plan. And then lastly, we believe, or at least what we're proposing, is that the policy require a plan for replenishment, so that if we're using contingency reserves, it should be accompanied with a plan for replenishment. Some sort of specificity here. If it's a one-time use, meaning just within a year, we're proposing to use reserves, we should be able to be pretty specific about how we're going to replenish that, when and how. But however, we're looking at, as we've had in the past, where we've had an extended use of, or an extended impact, like a recession that lasts 2 or 3 years, and therefore we're proposing to use some reserves in tandem with other measures, that the plan probably couldn't be as specific as we'd like it to be, but it should still provide for kind of a more broad or general long-term plan for how we're going to replenish those reserves. So really that concludes our report, and I'm going to go back to this just to have it available. I'd be happy to answer any questions
Okay.
at this point.
Questions or comments from committee members? Mr. White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The comment about funding capital, I'm trying to go back to that slide before we. Excuse me 1 second while I just try and find. Had it just a second ago.
Mr. White, is that this slide here?
Yes, there you go. So the surplus would be calculated after funding of annual capital program. How would that relate to our budget this year,
Sure.
for example?
So just to give you
Do
some
we get
little...
to the 2.1?
Sure. Just to give you some perspective, in the olden days, in the late 90s, we used to generate sufficient surpluses that allowed us to not have to fund our capital program within our revenues because we had sufficient reserves above policy. Back then, we didn't have to be as aggressive with our revenue estimates, so we generally had a surplus at the end of each year, and we were building up reserves above policy that we then used for capital. But more recently, because of the tighter budgets and the economic impacts, we've been having to fund our capital program. We've budgeted our capital program within revenues. So we don't rely on reserves anymore because we can't. So we build into our budgets every year somewhere between $700,000 and $1 million. It probably should be more, but we've been only able to afford about that every year. So if you look at next year's recommended budget, you'll see that we've included approximately about $1 million for capital that is being funded, at least being proposed to be funded from our revenues. So revenues are covering the operating cost as well as the $1 million of capital. And it's a balanced budget. So if things go exactly as we anticipate, we would end up with the year with no surplus. However, we know that at the end of each year, we generally or have seen in the past revenues exceeding our estimates, but more likely scenario is that our expenditures will come under budget. We have traditionally been under budget on expenditures between $1 million and $1.5 million. And even though we included, as in the last few years, an amount for anticipated year-end variance, we have in the last at least couple of years, or last year for sure, and this year we're expecting that we're still going to have a surplus beyond that. So that's the reserve I'm talking about. It's above covering operating revenue costs as well as covering our annual capital program. If we had a surplus, that's the part that would be allocated as suggested on this slide.
Okay. How do you mesh that up with the 2.1?
Right.
That was the number to stay even, right?
Right.
At least as I imagine it, that would be the number that you'd be trying to
Sure.
hit, so you're not falling further behind.
Right.
And yet, so
Yeah,
talk
and
to me about that.
currently our budget next year, as recommended, doesn't provide for funding any more than the $1.2 million we're currently funding. So in order to come up with an additional amount of money, like $900,000, we would have to find a way to cut other parts of the fund. So we have to cut somewhere else to free up $900,000 on an annual basis to come up to the $2.1 million. The recommended budget doesn't suggest that. It still assumes a level funding of 1.2. So our options are really, if we want to get to that number, we're going to have to basically, find a way to cut other parts of the general fund in order to free up that money.
And practically what I think will happen is that the way that Mr. Dewey gets his money from the general fund departments is he charges them all on a square foot basis. In fact, we actually, I think probably 4 or 5 years ago, that number was actually smaller, and we increased it by $500,000 a year because it was such a bad situation.
Wow.
But what I would expect is that as the economy improves, we will be ratcheting up those charges to the operating departments to get closer to the 2.1 that we need rather than the 1.2 that he's currently charging. And I also, what I would expect is that part of that, if we take 50% of that and put it in the general fund capital sinking fund, is then we will also use some of that for kind of the projects that we can identify that, you know, if like Parks and Rec will come in and say we want to rehabilitate a restroom or something like that, which will then have an impact on what that liability is that Mr. Dewey's been trying to deal with, just like we've done the last few years when we redid the Carrillo Recreation Center with redevelopment. That reduced that liability now that Mr. Dewey was going to have to deal with. So it will probably approach it from both sides, slowly ratchet up what we put into Mr. Dewey's fund directly, and then deal with some of the more critical problems if we have more money in that capital sinking fund.
Okay, so that's where, at least I was picturing that capital sinking fund as being separate from the 2.1, if I can get too specific. But I'm hearing you say that, in fact, that capital sinking fund could be used to fund that additional unmet need in the capital maintenance.
Yeah, because typically some of the projects that come to us, when we prioritize them, we try and say, okay, what are the most critical projects? And they generally are these facilities that we have that just really need work immediately. We can't wait.
Exactly. Well, and then a comment, Mr. Chair. Just we hear, in particular, Mr. Armstrong each year at the city address talk about how we're holding our own and doing pretty well in lots of good areas, but that the infrastructure area is struggling. And this is a grim summary. This puts some numbers to that are enormous, and they're kind of like it's interesting. I mean, the numbers are kind of similar scale when I think about the unfunded pension liability. As I recall, that was $250 million. You know, they're sort of similar numbers, and it's discouraging, or I don't know what word to use, but you know, how do you look out there and say, okay, what are we leaving to the next generation, and of course, how do we dig our way out of it? It's disconcerting, Mr. Chair.
It's a very difficult question. I agree.
And I'll just continue on about the contingency reserves. I appreciate that staff has taken some sort of, I would call them, at least from my own perspective, my random thoughts, but and a collection of thoughts, and that is your job each week, is to take this collection of thoughts and try and distill them down to something that's cohesive. And I think you've done a good job of taking a slice at it, taking a shot at it. I'm still kind of, it's probably even just a minor item, the notion of whether something is a supermajority vote for the contingency reserves or a simple majority. I'm not sure it's even, you know, that, as I believe Mr. Armstrong said in the past, it would take a simple majority to change the vote to a simple majority. But so I found myself hesitating on that in that area. But I sure appreciate the need to elevate the conversation around reserves to one where people are going, this is, I just feel like it probably wasn't happening during some of those years where it was, this is just, money is just available. I mean, you were there for some of those conversations, and I wasn't listening on that. And we do definitely need that decision to be stepping across a serious line. And I do think that these suggestions head us in that direction. Again, I look at the big picture stuff, and I don't know how even quite to start turning the corner on that. Obviously, we're just reeling from the loss of millions of dollars of the RDA money, which was our one tool that we had left in our box, and now it's gone. So what was the expression? The zero sum. We're now at we're zero sum budgeting in the capital reserve program. Sounds like that's where we're starting again now. I'm trying to come up with an idea going forward, and I'd love to hear other people's ideas on how others see that as possible going forward.
Full of challenges and opportunities. That's my optimistic spin. I have a question about. Oh, and by the way, Mr. White, speaking about the contingency fund, I think that, though I agree that the council can decide at any time to change its self-imposed rules, that having that self-imposed rule of having a supermajority in order to use money from the contingency fund is something that will help people think twice. One of the things we have to remember is that people can serve at most 8 years on city council, and so the institutional memory is constantly being recycled and evaporated. So I think having those kinds of triggers, just to make people realize this is an important thing that we're doing, is a great idea. So I strongly support the idea of having a supermajority vote for use of the contingency funds. I also have a question about that, and I don't know what the right answer is. So it's a real question, not a rhetorical one. I understand the concept of not wanting to get too formulaic about how you use or when is the appropriate moment to use contingency funds. But if we take seriously the concept that the contingency funds are supposed to be used for unplanned or unexpected events, it seems to me there might be some kind of objective way of saying what's an unplanned or unexpected economic event. Like, for instance, a revenue decline that is twice as great as whatever the noise level has been in previous revenue estimates over the last 20 years, or something like that. Because no revenue estimate is going to be exactly right, and I don't know how much we're typically off, 0.5%, 1%, whatever. But perhaps a definition of an economic downturn that would allow the use of contingency funds might be something that's greater outside of that noise by some amount. But then the question, and I don't know what that would be, but then the question becomes, let's say, as in the recent recession, it became very clear in the first year of the slide downward that the slide downward was probably going to continue. So the second year of the recession was, I would argue, not unexpected. And would we still say we should be using contingency funds in the second year of a recession, or the third year of a recession? I'm curious about, Mr. Armstrong, what you think about that.
You know, if you look at how we've dealt with this last recession, we did, I think, what you're suggesting, and that is once we knew we were in a recession, we held positions vacant, we cut expenses, and we actually didn't use what we now would call contingency reserves to balance. We just basically worked with the employee groups to get concessions, the furlough, and shrunk the size of the organization because it was clear we had to deal with it, and also we had the problem that we were already into the contingency reserves and we didn't want to use any more of them. So I agree with you. I think it's that first year when it's unexpected. You think about September 2008. Really, the bottom dropped out. And that we knew we had a recession, and we had done a budget that assumed that we were going to have a dip in revenues, but then the bottom just dropped out, and that would have been an appropriate time to use reserves. I think actually in that case we used a little, but not much, when we dealt with that. But yeah, I agree, that would be the time to deal with it. Mm-hmm. I think we struggled with what's the formula you use and how would you come up with that, other than to say a unexpected drop in revenues beyond what was anticipated, or but do you put a number on it or not?
Okay, thank you. How are you suggesting that we go forward with this in terms of a recommendation to council?
I guess I would suggest that if you're comfortable with the concepts that are represented within this draft document, and you have no other suggested changes to this policy as kind of we presented to you in concept, we would take this to the full council and get their feedback. I think it'd probably be appropriate, if it's okay with the committee, that maybe we want to as an option, to wait to get the feedback from the Water Commission, the Harbor Commission, and department heads that have enterprise funds, so we can come back to talk about enterprise funds, so we can put together a sort of a more of a cohesive policy document that we would take to council that is, a complete document that includes not just the general fund, but all the enterprise funds as well as the internal service funds. So that'd be another approach.
Okay.
I may give you a little different take.
Okay.
One, I think, because we just laid this on you today, I think we should come back in a couple of weeks and really go through this with a fine-tooth comb and make sure you're comfortable with it. And quite honestly, I think I'd like to accelerate the general fund part, get it done, and then if it takes us a couple months from the enterprise, we can come back. And I'm not expecting huge recommendations from the enterprise operations. I think the one area that they will have some discussion is the waterfront, because the Harbor Preservation Fund is not a percentage. I think it's 2 to 5 million. And it's a flat number, and I think at least that should generate some discussion if we want to go to a percentage there, and that may take some time. But we've been working on this general fund and talking about it now for a couple of years, and I guess I'd like to get it off that list of things to do. And and I think it's important to have that discussion with the full council. But I also think you guys need a chance to wordsmith this thing a little more than just today.
Okay. That seems like a reasonable suggestion to me.
Okay, that's fine. I have one more.
Sure, Mr.
comment.
White.
Thank you. This is the one. It's a detail, and you answered it in a way that assuaged concerns. But in this one, where that funding of the annual capital program, I get back to that little $2.1 million deal. Why wouldn't that be funded first before you start putting money into the capital sinking fund? And I appreciate what you're saying is when you go into the capital sinking fund to backfill that 2.1. But why wouldn't, isn't that 2.1 the maintenance? That is the slimmest of monies to be funding that huge deficit and huge amount of need that's out there.
And I think the way we looked at this is when we get the surpluses, oftentimes it's because revenues exceed expectations or the department's underexpend, and it's something you find out. We have a rough estimate now of what the surplus is going to be, but we're not exactly sure what it is. And so this is kind of, this money is, we find out about it 4 months after the end of the fiscal year. It's hard to build that into the budget and have Mr. Dewey plan to spend it. Although what I would expect is that he would come and say, hey, now that I know you have $1.5 million in that capital sinking fund, I'd like to propose these projects. And then the following year, that would be in the capital budget, and we would say, this is a project to be funded from the capital sinking fund, and that would show as the revenue source. That's kind of how I think it would work. But meanwhile, we would also then try and also ratchet up on the other end to get because really what we should do is have the departments pay that full share every year, and so he's got level funding, and we don't get any deeper into the hole.
Certainly. So I think if my fellow committee members are comfortable with the concept, I like Mr. Armstrong's suggestion of taking a couple weeks, coming back to the Finance Committee, and we all have ample opportunity to think about this some more and forward any suggestions. And I don't think that requires an action. If everyone agrees that's a suitable approach.
So, Mr. Armstrong, you're talking about early June?
I'll let Mr. Samario figure out when on the schedule it works and when you're all here. But it'd be sometime in the next 3 weeks, I think.
Okay.
If you guys have a specific date.
I will make room in my schedule for it.
Very good.
And I'll be sure to send you an electronic version of this policy document. And if I understand Mr. Armstrong's suggestion, then we would still go back to council after that to flesh out more and get their thoughts on this portion of it, but then still, before we finalize the document, wait to hear back. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think after all this extensive work here in Finance Committee, Council will be just thrilled. So.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.